Hello. In this episode of Airs for Architecture, I speak with Professor Kim Dovey of the Melbourne School of Design, University of Melbourne, about his research and writing on the morphologies, forms, logics, production and meaning of informal settlements and architecture.
When you look at, say, the Google Earth and you go to some of the global south cities, you will find patches that are very clearly informal settlements, and you can identify them because of their irregular morphologies. But then there's a much larger part of those cities which are informal in different ways and in mixed ways, and not in singular ways. There's no kind of continuum between a formal city and an informal city. There's many different kinds of mix between formality and informality as the formal city becomes informalized and as the informal city becomes formalized. And both of those processes are going on at the same time and across much of the city.
Airs for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Airs for Architecture. I'm talking today to Kim Dovey. Professor Kim, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself?
Well, I'm an academic. I'm originally an architect who now approaching the end of my career really at the University of Melbourne. But I grew up in Western Australia where I studied architecture. I practiced for a fairly short period of time where I decided that I was relatively ignorant about architecture. I was always interested in the social dimensions of architecture, but I really didn't think I was well equipped to engage in that way. And so I went back to university to do a research degree, first of all a master's degree, which of course just raised a whole lot of new questions. And then I went and did a PhD at Berkeley in California. And I've had an academic career pretty much ever since. I suppose that how I got into that was that I think I decided that architecture was much bigger than I had been led to believe. That I thought it was simply about designing buildings, but then of course buildings are connected to everything else. And I decided for a long time that it was really about something much larger, which I called place or place theory. What are these things that we call places, that whether they're rooms or houses or larger buildings or neighborhoods or cities. So I was always interested in the kind of the multi-scalar aspects of architecture and how architecture connects to everything else. And of course, when you start to study that, it just gets more and more complex and the questions never stop, and they still haven't. So here I am.
That's really good. So who did you do your PhD under at Berkeley?
Well, it's not a British European type PhD. So there's a committee of people. There was a sociologist called Russell Ellis. There's a landscape architecture academic, Claire Cooper Marcus. But I worked with other people such as Donald Appleyard and one or two others. So it's a kind of a collective form of supervision in that system.
See. And what was Berkeley like? Was that in the 1980s?
It was in the 1980s. It was very exciting. It was for me, it was a liberation. Although I very quickly discovered that Berkeley was one of the very few places in the US where I actually enjoyed. I found a lot of it fairly problematic, but Berkeley was great. It was an intellectually very liberating place. It was a place where, I grew up in Australia that I found a bit stultifying, and so I found that the intellectual environment very liberating.
Yeah, and there's a big movement at Berkeley, wasn't there, under people like Henry Sanoff, development of thinking around participatory and socially orientated architecture, which is, I don't know, from what you're saying, this idea of place, perhaps we can get onto that, but this idea of the social dimensions of architecture is kind of critical in that Berkeleyite kind of thinking.
Yeah, well, Berkeley had, to some degree, kind of specialized, at least at that time. I think it's changed a bit since then.
Mhm.
I mean, there was a period from the 60s onwards, really, because Berkeley was the heart of a lot of the social changes of the 60s in the US.
Mhm.
And the Berkeley School, they'd hired Chris Alexander, who was there at the time. He
Yeah.
wasn't a supervisor of mine, but he was but I got to know him a little bit. Um, Lots of interesting people, lots of really interesting ideas. There were historians like Spiro Kostoff and so on, who were really at the front end of trying to rethink architectural history from a social point of view as well. One of the revelations was that these people were at each other's throats. They weren't exactly going off and having coffee together.
That's quite funny. I spent a short period of time in Berkeley, and it is a wonderful kind of environment. It makes you feel liberated, even if you're not. But we're talking today because I've read your work since I started my own academic studies, which was a long time ago, 2007, I think, and came across your work on urban informality and some of your thinkings around that, which was critical to what I was looking at that time. And we're going to talk today. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about this book that you've got coming out with Bloomsbury, The Atlas of Informal Settlements, Understanding Self-Organized Urban Design, which I don't know if is the final title, but that's the title they have on the Bloomsbury website at the moment. And perhaps track backwards towards how you get to informality as a focus of your current research, through ideas of morphogenesis and assemblage. But maybe you could tell us a little bit about this Atlas of Informal Settlement. What is it? I mean, it sounds extraordinarily interesting, but diffuse.
Well, I suppose I'd actually always been interested in informality, although I hadn't necessarily always called it that. But I'd always been interested in participatory process, and in trying to go beyond some kind of romantic notion that somehow this meant architects settling back and enjoying a sort of a community process. So, but a lot of my earlier work was engaged with questions of power and architecture, and a lot of that, and particularly the book Framing Places, was really a critique of highly problematic practices of power. So it was a critique of places like shopping malls and centres of power and housing projects. And they were nearly all global north, at least global north in origin, if not in location, kind of projects, and trying to critique them. But I had always really wanted to go beyond that and to try and understand, if you like, community practices of producing architecture. I got interested in the informal settlement stuff because I was traveling a fair bit, mostly throughout my region when I was, some of it was administrative stuff, really going on the sort of quasi-marketing trips for the faculty, trying to recruit international students for my faculty and trying to engage our school in Melbourne more with our own region, because we see ourselves as being in Asia. And of course, the big cities and the big issues in our region are in those big mega cities of Manila, Jakarta, South Asia, and so on. And I suppose my experience in those cities led me to believe that there were much bigger issues at stake than simply trying to stop the worst excesses of shopping malls and gated communities in the global north. So that's where most of the more recent work has been, and that's what's led to the current book, which is the Atlas of Informal Settlement, which will be out later this year. So you asked me to talk about that. It's a fairly long-term project with a bunch of colleagues and now former PhD students, where we have tried to build a new theory of urban design around the design and planning of informal settlements. So, and trying to move on from this understanding of informal settlements as some kind of euphemism for a slum, and to understand that this is actually much better defined as a mode of production. A mode of production that's not separate from the formal modes of production that we're much more familiar with, but trying to understand that most of architecture, indeed most of urban design and urban planning as well, is about teaching us about how the formal system works. So, and the formal system, of course, is one where there's a state and there's a planning system, and there are planning rules and regulations, and so there's a policy framework, and then there is an urban design framework which is laid out, and then the architecture follows. So that nearly all of formal architecture, there is already a street network, there's a plot boundary, and there's a set of rules within which the architecture is permitted to emerge. And there may be struggles and contests over how that occurs. And of course, there's lots of internecine disputes between architects and planners along the way. But informal settlement is really something else again. And it's not simply defined as the production of slums. Sure, some of the outcomes are substandard, and the substandard, though, in a whole range of different ways. And that's an important part of this research, but it is not a study of slums, because informal settlement is in many ways the antithesis of a production of slums, because almost every act of informal settlement is a form of upgrading. Mostly it's an upgrading of underutilized urban land into productive housing. So I like to think of it as a production of affordable housing. And I understand that the hackles that can raise among a lot of people who say, but it's substandard housing that that is being produced. And I say, well, sometimes it's substandard in some ways, but it can't simply be condemned as a slum. This word slum is a slur word that we have to learn how to avoid, and that has been noted by quite a few people for a long period of time now. And indeed, there was a concerted effort in the development industry to get rid of the word slum. It was almost like it was targeted as a kind of a bad word, as if, and the phrase informal settlement just slowly but surely seeped in as a kind of a polite way to say the same thing without actually doing any research on how this works and what's actually going on. So I suppose my research in this area has been to try and articulate the way in which informal urban design in particular works, but it's an informal architecture and an informal urban planning as well. These settlements are planned, they are designed, they are constructed, and they're constructed with design intent, and it may not have the kind of form and the kind of valorization that architecture normally has in the formal framework. But it's a production of affordable housing. And so this is part of enlarging the definition of architecture, if you like.
Yeah. I've used as a sort of basic idea that informality or informal settlements, you're absolutely right about the word slum. There's a sort of onomatopoeia to the word that makes it sound slightly disgusting, sort of like slug and slob and things like that. Slum, it's sort of, when you use the word, you kind of have to picture, your mind immediately pictures a kind of downbeat thing, but informality is really about lack of tenure, isn't it? That's what the principal characteristic, or the main characteristic of every informal settlement is a lack of legal tenure.
No, I wouldn't really agree with that. I'd say it's more complex than that. That any attempt to reduce informality to kind of one thing, it's possible to reduce it and say, okay, well, it's about lack of tenure, but it's also possible, and I think in a slightly different way, to reduce it and say, well, it's about illegality. It's a polite way of saying that these settlements are illegal. But then there's other ways of defining what informality is as well, so that we can define them in morphological terms or formal terms as irregular settlements, meaning they have that, in a sense, they're defined by not having a kind of formal order. And they can be defined also as a kind of insurgency. They have a kind of an illegibility about them. They're actually hard to read, which is a part of the reason that we use a slur word like slum, which conflates a whole series of prejudices, really, about. I mean, a lot of them do have forms of tenure, right? And there's multiple forms of tenure, but the large words that incorporate all of this, like slum, tend to conflate all of those things into one kind of package and say, oh, well, it's bad. We have to stop this, right? And how do we stop it? Well, we formalize it. And how do we formalize it? Well, first of all, we have to erase it and replace it with what we know works. And that, of course, is a part of the disease that I see going on in so much of the developing world, where these settlements are not studied, so we don't understand them because we don't need to understand them because they have to be erased. I mean, why would you need any better research on a settlement that's going to disappear? The truth is, they're not disappearing. You know that there's up to 2 billion people live in settlements that are largely produced informally. But the other thing I think we need to say is that the informality is it's not like a separate thing. It's always engaged with the formal processes of the city, and it camouflages itself within the formal practices of the city. So there are formal architectures that become informalized, and that's one of the key processes that takes place. And so the incapacity to simply reduce the informality or informal settlement to one thing, whether it's illegal or lacking in tenure or substandard in some way, the way to go beyond the word slum is to look hard at what's actually going on. And what's going on is many things, right? It's not one thing. And so much of, when you look at, say, the Google Earth and you go to some of the global south cities, you will find patches that are very clearly informal settlements, and you can identify them because of their irregular morphologies. But then there's a much larger part of those cities which are informal in different ways and in mixed ways, and not in singular ways. There's no kind of continuum between a formal city and an informal city. There's many different kinds of mix between formality and informality as the formal city becomes informalized, and as the formal city and as the informal city becomes formalized. And both of those processes are going on at the same time and across much of the city. And so one of the things you learn really is that this is also part of a larger story that those of us in the global north can do well to learn about our own cities, is that all cities are a mix of formal and informal processes.
That's really, really sort of a sort of brilliant way of a sort of an ebb and flow of urbanization. But perhaps I think it would be kind of useful to understand the sort of origins of this phenomenon, because it is, even though obviously informality as a urban form is as old as time, you could argue, I'm sure people have, that places like Venice have very similar qualities, insofar as there's not an overarching and top-down application of a kind of an urban logic that is discernible to a kind of, I suppose, mathematical formulation. But where do they start? You have people like Ananya Roy, as I put in my notes to you, and people like Hernando de Soto who seem to associate them with capitalism, and later capitalism particularly, as a kind of pathological or genius of neoliberal capitalism. I mean, is that how it's read, or are you dealing with something much older here?
Well, we're dealing with something much older. Both of those views, the ones that have been identified at least with the work of Ananya Roy and De Soto and so on, both of those are understandable because the growth and proliferation of informal settlements is largely since the middle of the 20th century, and indeed can be linked to the expansion of global capitalism and the globalization that's occurred since then, and particularly the rise of neoliberal capitalism. And so you can see informality in that sense as a part of a kind of deregulatory regime, that it certainly suits global capitalism to have this kind of deregulated production of affordable housing that will help to reproduce cheap labor. Okay, so you can bring that kind of, if you like, neo-Marxist critique to the kind of proliferation of informal settlements that's going on, and I wouldn't argue with that. I think that's basically right. What I don't go along with is the idea that is what produces informal settlement. Informal settlement is much older. Indeed, it's the what I sometimes call the form of urbanism.
The what form?
The form, in the sense that the is the original form of urbanism. That informality comes first. Now, the way in which we use the language, the language of informal, sounds as if it's been in a sense defined as if the formal is normal and the informal is the aberration to the normal. But actually it's the other way around. Informality comes first. It's the original form of urbanism. If you look at the original cities, the earliest of anything that we might call a city, they emerge from informal incremental processes. Okay, the vernacular and the village and so on have these informal in the sense of not formally codified. They're produced by a logic and by a set of urban and design practices. So the vernacular architecture and vernacular urbanism are a part of this, and that this, in a sense, an older code of how built environments and how cities are produced was informal. This does not make it more important, by the way. I think that my way of understanding it is that formality is in many ways a response to the excesses and the problems of urban informality. So, in a sense, if you look at a lot of the kind of Mediterranean villages that have become global tourism hotspots, a part of what attracts people there is a kind of an aesthetic quality to that kind of vernacular architecture and urbanism. And in those cases, the informality has not escalated into what I think of as overdevelopment. It's overdevelopment that, in a sense, causes slums. So that a lot of informal settlements, grow in a fairly incremental way, and then indeed the architecture may be makeshift and there may be problems, but that this is what self-organized production does, and it slowly kind of upgrades. It is a form of upgrading, but if it continues, particularly under conditions of poverty, then you get what I'm calling overdevelopment, where what is a narrow laneway, where maybe nothing wrong with a narrow laneway that's only 1 or 2 meters wide because it's highly social. The cars can't get in there, and it often fattens up into really vibrant little open spaces. But if that process continues and people build more and more rooms on top and they cantilever them over the public space, it turns those laneways into tunnels that become unlivable. And so a lot of the problems that we then conflate under the term slum are produced by, if you like, a lack of coding in the informal development process. So it's been trying to understand those underlying codes, and there's a lot of interesting work in this regard. I mean, the work of Besim Hakim in the book, it's called Mediterranean Urbanism. It's a pretty interesting read in regard to the way in which the more ancient codes of urbanism produced cities that were not just highly functional, but really very beautiful. And I don't want to sound romantic about that, because there's nothing much romantic about it. But trying to understand the way in which that process or a similar process happens in informal settlement is pretty important. So I actually see a need, if you like, for formalization, because there's this notion that, excuse me, that all cities are a mix of formal and informal process, brings a kind of an imperative to understand the way in which the informal can get out of hand, but then the formal can get out of hand too. You know, there's quite a lot of cities, or parts of cities, more to the point, which are over informalized. I mean, a lot of what we, is usually loosely termed temporary tactical urbanism in global north cities, pop-ups, and then is an attempt to introduce new forms of informality into over-formalized rich cities where, in a sense, the controls of urban design and planning have become sanitized and boring, frankly.
And also delivered, I don't know if you agree, but delivered through financial, economic systems, political systems which privilege a certain caste of people and corporations delivering urbanism. But I'm really, so there's so much in what you're saying that I think is really very, very interesting. For example, the question that then comes up, if formal urbanism is characterized by formalized systems of procurement and production and management, maintenance, and that can become excessive. What are the processes involved in informal? Is it a grassroots and negotiated practice, or is it that informal settlements are characterized by formal governance structures, often enough gangsters? My assumption has been. So is it that there are formal structures? It's just that they're not the formal structures.
Well, the reason we wrote a book about this rather than an article is that it's fairly complex, and there's really quite a lot of answers to some of those really important questions. In a formal urban design and planning process, the urban design and planning comes first, and then the architecture follows. In an informal process, in the most informal of informal settlements, the architecture comes first, or tends to come first. So people just build buildings. And if you like, the street network is then an emergent phenomenon that comes out of the whatever spaces are left after the buildings are produced. But then there's a lot of processes which are much more mixed than that as well. So that there may be like a track or some kind of road which provides access, and then the settlement then accumulates along that road because of the access. And when that access is used up, then laterals emerge. So between whatever buildings have been built. So in a sense, the architecture co-determines the outcome with a longer development process. So there's a kind of a co-evolution of architecture and urban design. That's one of the key differences between informal settlement and formal settlement, where urban design always comes first, or at least the layout of the street network. Another big difference is that plots nearly always exist in a formal process. And in an informal process, plots may or may not exist. Plots defined as a bounded section of land which is marked out for usually for privatized use, right? So that in order for a client to present a project to an architect, there must be a plot which they have control of. But in informal settlement, there are very often no plots. People just build wherever they can find, but it's not as if it's not random. They don't just build wherever they happen to be. There are locations that are chosen, and they're chosen on a range of different criteria, including political criteria, often social criteria. There's relatives who've built nearby, and here you can do at the back of what they're doing. but it's often that some deal has been done with a local politician, that a blind eye will be turned here, and that the votes from this community will flow to that politician, and so on. There's a lot of politics to this, and it's not possible in any given situation to generalize too much. So, sure, there are gangs, what are often called land mafias or land traffickers, involved in quite a lot of these. And the boundaries between community-based settlement and land trafficking or land mafias are not always clear. They may be blurred, right? So that this is an urban development process, and like any urban development process, there is a lot of capital involved, and there's a lot of money to be made. And if underutilized public land can be in a sense privatized in this way by taking over riverbanks or vacant land, then in the long term, in a capitalist context, the capitalism will move into that space, and so the community-based organisation can be, if you like, the harbinger of a larger capitalist process. And these things are not separate, right? So that if I call this self-organized, that begs the question of what self means. You know, is self some individual who's gone out to build a hut on a riverbank, or is it a family or a household, or is it a small group of people? In the Latin American experience, there's a lot of semi-organized land invasions by large numbers of people who need affordable housing in a particular location, and they organize to do it all at one time. And that's, and again, a political act which gives a certain safety in numbers. And these are all what we might call self-organized practices, but it's still that question of what self means. I would probably draw a line when you start to get into land traffickers and land mafias, but in many cases, the land mafias and the land traffickers follow and come in and try to cash in on what has already happened. So, sure, there's a lot of evidence of, and a lot of different words are used to describe these kind of practices, which are essentially profit-making, sometimes syndicates, and it may be that community leaders are co-opted into these processes, right? So that a community leader can become a part of what I think we probably should call corruption.
So, but that process can come from the formal side as well, can't they? David Schlossberg's work on environmental justice, he wrote a wonderful paper years ago, and he talks about the threefold aspects of environmental justice being recognition, representation, and rights, which that's me praising him, of course. But this idea that in an informal environment where you lack tenure as one of the characteristics of your settlement, you then are denied representation, political representation. And at the point that you're denied political representation, you lack rights. And so the formal sector, by granting certain types of rights to informal communities, can function like, if gangs can operate from the ground up or from within the community, then it's certainly possible in the development and the nourishing the production of informality for the formal sector to be incorporated into that as well.
Oh yeah, and indeed there are many stories out there, and indeed quite a lot of stories in the Atlas. So the Atlas is essentially 51 stories, right? So we did 51 case studies of informal settlements in different parts of the world, sort of everywhere from Mongolia to South Africa and everywhere in between. And we were looking for the variety of different informal settlement processes, with informal settlement fairly broadly defined. Some of these settlements are not something you'd look at and say, oh, gee, there's an informal settlement. So they include anything up to 6-story buildings, and highly durable apartment buildings. So there's quite a lot of what some people call elite informality, and there's a couple of examples of that as well, where sort of middle class housing is produced within an informal context, or at least where parts of that process are informal. Possibly the land use is informal, even if there is some formal control over the, if you like, the durability of the construction. So there's many different kinds of informality, different degrees of informality. So a part of what we're trying to do is to avoid any stereotype about what an informal settlement looks like or how it operates. So our frame is fairly broad in that regard. There are, with regard to the tenure issue, there are also many different kinds of tenure. I know I keep giving the same answer, that it's more complex than that, but there is so much kind of reduction of informal settlement to singular ways of seeing things, as if, I mean, this is a production of affordable housing that, and I'm going to repeat this, it's hard to measure this, but it could be up to about 2 billion people. So in population terms, this is the most important production of urbanization process going on the planet at the moment. It's that important, it's that big, it's huge. And these settlements, are overwhelmingly permanent. This is the permanent infrastructure for many of these cities, that these settlements, even if the architecture is demolished, the infrastructure will likely survive, because this is not only a production of buildings, but a production of the street network and so on. Once you've built and designed and built an access network onto, say, a difficult to access escarpment, that's there, and it's going to be used. And these settlements are permanent, and the best of the state responses to these, many of them in Latin America, I've got to say, are accepting of this. They accept that this is the way it's happened, and that the challenge is to incorporate these settlements into the formal structures of urban governance, and huge numbers of success stories in doing that. The local municipal administration simply gears into that informal process, learns how it works, understands that this soccer field has been built by the local community with a community building nearby, and they need a better building, and maybe they need a bigger soccer field, and so you can do that, and of course the role of architects, landscape architects, urban designers in this becomes crucial, because you actually badly need professionals who can move between those formal and informal worlds in order to affect an effective upgrading process.
The book is obviously, an atlas of informal settlements, which speaks of maps. So I wanted to ask, you use this word morphogenesis or morphology, which is a word that is kind of chucked around in architectural schools and then disappears once you go into practice, more or less. And it's quite an interesting word, but I also wanted to tap into this idea of mapping. So this idea of an atlas being a book of maps, and you've talked about in your other book that we were sharing today, that your publishers shared with me, Mapping Urbanities, which is again a terrifically interesting book that kind of, to me, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, sort of is the bridging point between your earlier work on power and this current piece of work on I'm not trying to draw a line around your life and your career, obviously, Kim, but it's kind of interesting for me as a reader to try and look for the lines between them. So I'm really interested in this idea of mapping and what mapping is, because I think, again, in architectural education, mapping is drawing maps, but your point in Mapping Urbanities, and I'm guessing in this idea of complexifying informal settlements, for one, is that mapping does more than that and is more than that and has a role to play in understanding informal settlements.
Yeah, look, mapping and diagramming are intimately linked into assemblage thinking, which is loosely the theoretical framework from which I've been operating for quite a long time.
What is assemblage thinking?
Well, assemblage thinking derives largely from the work of Deleuze and Guattari and this wonderful book, this most useful book called A Thousand Plateaus, which is close to unreadable for a lot of people the first time, but is really packed with insight. It's a philosophy book, but it's also a politics book, and it's a way of thinking. For me, it's a way of thinking about cities and about architecture that is fundamentally relational. So you're always looking at relations rather than things. So a part of my discomfort with traditional approaches to architecture has been very thing-oriented, very object-oriented. To see a building, and of course the building will have a context, it'll have a site, but the focus is always on the building, and that's understandable from the point of view of that architecture fills a role as a profession where it procures and shapes buildings for clients on particular sites and so on. I get that, and that needs to be done well and professionally. But the kind of object thinking that goes into that focuses attention away from the interrelations. And in a sense, I would say that buildings are produced by their interrelations with clients, with the site, and so on. The mapping and the diagramming comes into that because it's part of what Deleuze and Guattari talk about in assemblage. There's not really a theory in the sense of being a coherent theory, but for me, it's a research framework. Mapping in that sense is not some simple illustrating or tracing of a particular urban condition, but a mode of research. And so mapping is it's a form of exploring the way in which cities or buildings work. So I've done this a lot, and I've done it at different scales. So one of the projects was actually looking at school buildings, and particularly that thorny question never seems to go away as to whether open plans or traditional cell-like school plans are better, which to me is the wrong kind of question, because the answer is usually yes to both of them. Some things you need closed rooms. You don't get liberation. Liberation in architecture is not produced by removing walls. You need kind of closed spaces for some things and at some times, and you need open spaces and connectivity for some things and at other times. And I don't also much like the rather strict boundary we draw between buildings and urban spaces. So I've got a bit of time for the work of people like Koolhaas, who've tried to erode that boundary between urban space and interior space, and the ways in which buildings bump people into each other or separate people from each other, and trying to get more critical about how that happens through building programming, I think, is rather important. So part of my concern with architecture is I think architecture has backed off a bit from engagement with social programs, with a focus on kind of formal outcomes. But I'm getting away from the question about mapping and diagramming, because I think that mapping for me is about understanding the complexity, particularly complexity of cities, and then delayering them and exploring particular aspects of them. So I'll give you an example. About 10 years ago, I was really interested in why it is that creative clusters are attracted to particular parts of cities and not other parts. Not whether some cities are more creative than others. It's, to me, a boring question. The real question is, why do you always find the creative industries in a particular city going for a particular kind of neighborhood? Was there something architectural and morphological about that? And one of the things we found was that it had a lot to do with the street interface, the way in which buildings connect with the street. Now, this is a fundamentally relational question. It's not about the building or about the street, but about how they relate to each other, the building interface. And we'd known for a long period of time from Jane Jacobs, who had talked about sidewalk life and eyes on the street and active edges and so on, that the interface was important. But it seemed to me that it had been a bit trivialized, as if an active edge is a good thing, and you get this a little bit through the work of Jan Gehl, which I much admire in many ways, but you kind of get the idea that an active interface is the only good kind of interface. And we were finding that that was certainly not the case with the kind of interviews we were doing, that many of the most creative industries what they were wanting was a range of different kinds of street interface, and indeed an adaptability of the interface, so that it could be one thing at one time and could be converted to something else, and perhaps even converted back. So I got interested in the adaptability of interfaces, and so I decided to map them. And they proved to be the most difficult things to map, because every time we came up with you need a simple typology in order to map anything. And every typology we came up with seemed to collapse, which seemed at first to be a kind of a failure of the research, until I began to realize that the incapacity to map something sometimes means that you're onto something that really matters, and so we kind of kept at it. And so there's some work in Mapping Urbanities, which is about the mapping of interfaces. And I don't want to go into that in too much detail, other than to say that mapping reveals things about the city, and so it is not simply an illustration of something that you've found. It's indeed it's the method. So there's a lot of mapping that goes on that gets thrown away, where you map stuff that turns out not to be interesting, but you're really mapping relations. And so in that sense, the map is not some kind of factual representation, even though it's got an empirical base. So it's a way of marrying a kind of an empirical approach to urban design to deeper questions about how cities work and what makes cities tick. Because I was convinced at that time, still am, that the micro scale assemblage of the public-private interface is really crucial to how cities work. And so trying to map that was important. But then we've mapped a lot of different things at a lot of different scales. And the Informal Settlement book, the Atlas, is a mapping book. And in that case, we were using Google Earth to map settlements at different phases of their development in order to try and reveal the changes in form, and indeed to try and tease out what the design process was, what were the intentions that were going on, how did you get to this kind of result. So we often look at you might look at a vernacular village and say, okay, you get all these twisted streetscapes and so on, and it's just been produced in some organic or natural way. But really, that's bullshit. There's nothing natural about cities.
No.
Cities are artificial through and through from the start. They're artificial. So they don't. I mean, sure, you can look at an escarpment settlement and say, well, it's following the natural topography of the slope, and that's sort of true to some degree. But when you drill down into that logic of escarpment developments, the kind of favelas that have become iconic informal settlements, I suppose, at least in Latin America. I mean, they're not the iconic ones in Southeast Asia, for instance, where it's a very different pattern. But if you just took the Latin American ones, you might say, well, obviously all the tracks go along the contour lines. Well, they don't. Yeah. But they climb the hill. They track. They track across it, and then they double back. Or buildings get built on the hill, and then the street, the lane network finds a way in between the buildings and adapts to them. And so there's an incremental logic to the way in which informal settlements develop. So in that case, we were simply mapping them at multiple times based on mostly Google Earth imagery, in some cases on the ground, kind of ground proofing, and then trying to articulate the spatial logic that is driving that process, so that any professionals who then go to engage with that are not simply cutting across what's already going on, which is a productive process, so that you work with that productive process rather than against it. And part of the reason you work with it, of course, is that it produces a better result. Those settlements are very often very, very spatially functional, and very often they will have highly protected public space that is very social and very productive, and indeed the external spaces of informal settlement are really crucial to the social life of the people who live there, especially under conditions of poverty, because when you've got an overcrowded interior, then you need to spill that domestic life, and you need to be able to. The kids need to be able to have space to play and stuff like that. And some of them, I don't want to sound romantic about this, but those protected pedestrian spaces in them are often quite a revelation in how well they work.
Yeah, this is a really interesting idea, because I think you're talking about mapping as a socio-physical, socio-built environment process. And I think that's what differentiates this kind of mapping that you're talking about, where you're looking at space, as both a relation, as you say, a relational thing. And I think when people do mapping, or certainly, younger architecture students and things like that do mapping, they find that idea very complicated, because you're presented with maps as this kind of objective truth. This is what space looks like, and as you point out in mapping places, that's not actually true. But mapping urbanity, sorry. I was wondering though, is there a comparator? So there's a wonderful paper that I get my students to read called "Just Folks Designing" by a chap called Rudolf Hester, American scholar, on the emergence of vernacular form, and he critiques this idea, this romantic idea that vernacular settlements and vernacular architecture emerges out of a kind of inborn native sense of home. And he says, this is no more reasonable. This is like saying that humans build settlements like birds build nests, is a kind of intuitive thing. And he criticizes this, and he talks about the kind of the production of vernacular settlements through oral processes of communication and knowledge, and the way that difference and discrepancy emerges within the framework of an overarching framework. And I was wondering if there was some comparison there with informality, insofar as when you look at, say, somewhere like Dovey, or you look at somewhere like Kibera in Africa, although there is, as you point out, clearly an insurgent quality to them, that is, it's not mediated in the same way as formal urbanism, there is also a peculiar uniformity to much of the residents themselves. They tend to be of a certain size. They tend to use a certain palette of materials. They tend to, they do conform to, as you say, a sort of urban framing. And so I wonder whether if you've done anything looking at the actual logics behind their production.
Yeah. So it's going to be a different logic in different places. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned a couple of places there, Dovey in Mumbai, mm-hmm. Which I spent a bit of time in some time back. There's a building typology there, which is primarily brick construction, reasonably durable, and the typology is really single room increments stacked vertically, or at least in the part of Dovey that we were looking at. So you get very, very dense and with very narrow lanes, and houses that are 2 to 4 stories high, with single rooms stacked one on top of the other. Mm. And of course, 4 rooms high is about as high as you can go, stacking one room on top of the other, especially if the first room wasn't built to take the next 3. And in general, there's a kind of spatial logic to incremental room by room construction, which is limited to about 4 stories. When it gets to 5 or so, it becomes precarious. Then you go to Kibera, there's a different logic that's operating. And Kibera, it's a mostly lightweight frame, elongated buildings. There's a lot more rental accommodation, although in Dovey there's quite a lot of rental as well. But the rental in Dovey, at least the part we were looking at, was primarily people owning a house and then building rooms on top to rent and renting them out. Whereas in Kibera, I think there's a lot more kind of absent landlords who are renting elongated buildings, very often single-story, fairly lightweight construction, galvanized iron. So if you look at the roofscape of Kibera, it's kind of it's a rusty galvanized iron system. Dovey would be a similar material, but the walls are different. There's different logics that operate in different places, and so in the escarpment settlements I was talking about before, they're going to be much more mediated by the topography, whereas in Kibera or in Dovey they're not. It's much flatter. When you look at, say, Southeast Asia and the kind of wet, somewhat flood-prone coastal cities such as Jakarta and Manila, where I've spent a fair bit of time, you find a different morphology emerging, very often linear settlements along the rivers or canals. Bangkok is similar. And again, it's so that there's different logics operate in different places, but they've got commonalities. So you will see some consistencies as well, particularly the incrementalism and the irregularity, which is a kind of hyper-adaptability apart from anything else, where buildings are only rarely produced more than 4 rooms at a time, and 1 room at a time is very, very common. And 1 room at a time, of course, is the process that is linked to poverty, to where you have to wait for the resources for the next room. And indeed, rooms are built less than 1 room at a time, so that the upper floor, you see so many houses with the reinforcing bars continuing beyond the roof in anticipation of the next floor being added. And that next floor might be, first of all, just a roof terrace with low walls around it, and then eventually it becomes a whole room, and the roof is added, and perhaps the roof terrace moves up one. So we need to learn how to understand this incremental production of architecture, indeed the co-production of both the architecture and the neighbourhood. So open space is being co-produced at the same time and is co-evolving in a highly adaptive way. And as I was saying before, need to be very aware of what we might call overproduction, because there's one of the rules about informal settlement is that there is no stopping rule. That in a sense, in the formal system, the stopping rule is that a plan done by an architect or an urban designer is the stopping rule. That if you want to change it, you have to go back and get another approval. And that's not the case in informal settlements. It's hyper adaptable. You keep changing it all of the time. There are settlements I've been back to 2 or 3 years apart, and lots of things have changed. New staircases go in, new rooms get added, bits and pieces get demolished. A lot of demolition in informal settlements is not done by the state. It's not some kind of mass erasure, but it is incremental erasure of buildings that were really just the first go. That you put up a makeshift building because that's all the resources you've got, and then you demolish it and replace it with a better one. Or you find that some building is really blocking an important access route, and so that there's a community process that says that'll be demolished and rebuilt somewhere else. So there's a lot of suck it and see that goes on in the design of informal settlements. And sometimes things don't work and they get changed. So there's a lot of adaptability. So, and trying to understand that adaptability and understand that as really a good thing. It's the kind of design thinking where when you make a mistake, you correct it. And you sometimes correct it before it's even fully built. And a lot of it is not mistakes either. It's that the first makeshift construction was always intended to be makeshift. It was intended to be demolished. And sometimes these are, if you like, land claims. They're kind of placeholders. You put up a cheap shack, and sometimes no one even living there. It's a way of claiming that land. And if nobody demolishes it, then you go in and invest the resources to make it a decent house. So
do you think that? I mean, you've talked, I think, really wonderfully, and this is the last question for you. I think. I'm sure, I promise. Is this issue around how architecture can take on this knowledge, how architecture and architects and architecture students can, because I think you're right, and I've always operated under, well, ever since knowing about this kind of work and your kind of work I've always assumed that this was in a way the orientation, the trajectory of city production. The sort of formal sector and architecture particularly, which is an incredibly elite enterprise, doesn't really have much to say about it. So how do we invest? What do we learn from these that we in the global north, if you are in the global north, dear listener, can sort of use? What can we use from this? I mean, you've got people like Alejandro Aravena with his elemental housing in Chile. Obviously doing something that sits somewhere between, where he creates a kind of core house which is robust and facilitates this adaptability. And I guess the success of those buildings will be in 20 years' time if they just don't exist, in a way. Is that what is Aravena's kind of model what we should be gunning for, or is there something more profound, more kind of bigger?
Yeah, that's a big question to end on. I'll try and give it.
Okay, answer it as 2 tweets.
I'm not a huge fan of Aravena's approach, but it's partly because it's actually a very old-fashioned approach in many ways. It's been around. It's not. I mean, I think he's been able to capture something of that. Approach of actually saying that, well, architecture provides a frame which is then able to be utilized by the community. There's one paper I've done with some colleagues which was looking at some of that work, and again that's got this problem of there not being a stopping rule, but that those projects don't necessarily contain the informal additions in a particularly effective way. But I wouldn't want to dump on those approaches, because I actually think that being more experimental in this is really important, and they have been fairly experimental in trying to find new approaches to that. I think there are many other kinds of approaches that architects can bring, because architects. So many architects who have got experience in this and have gone off and in a sense moved into the development area have kind of retreated from architecture and have become, if you like, either activists or planners or development consultants of some kind. I'm interested in seeing more architects experimenting and working with communities to engage in and to deploy the particular architecture skills, which really are about form making. That architects spend a lot of time thinking hard about space and form and how buildings work and how to put them together. And I really just want to enlarge that, to incorporate the notion that that the finished product is not going to stay exactly as you leave it. So to retreat a bit from the, if you like, the fetish for form that inhabits the architecture profession, and to see architecture in a broader way as engaging in this longer term and much larger process of making change in the built environment, but changes that will then be subject to further changes again. So I'm interested in learning to design for capacities, right? So that I think this is true not only of the architecture profession, but also of the planning profession, that the planning profession has been fixated on developing plans where we try and move the city incrementally towards some kind of ideal, But those ideals are usually ideologies that are a bit disconnected from what's really going on in the city. So I'm interested in both architects and planners talking to each other more, but also moving towards an understanding that that cities and buildings and neighborhoods have certain capacities for change, and those are capacities for a better future, right? So that architecture and design is one of the most optimistic of professions, because it's always looking for a better future. And I don't want to abandon that, but I want to take away some of the utopianism from it and say, let's deal with the cities that we have, the cards that we've been dealt. And the cards we've been dealt is the world that we have. And it's a world that is in many ways thoroughly dysfunctional, with deep social inequalities and with huge challenges with regard to climate change and social inequality. So, and those really are the two big issues, kind of global inequalities and poverty on the one hand, and then climate change on the other. And in order to deal with those, I think we have to have a much more adaptable kind of architecture, where the contribution that we make is a contribution not just to a more pleasing building now, but if you like, an ongoing part of an assemblage.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. It was a wonderful point to stop on.
Okay, thank you very much. And that was fun. Yeah.
If you don't know, now you know. Thanks to the good professor for taking time out to talk to me and for sharing his books. Look out for the Atlas of Informal Settlements, released in August with Bloomsbury, and check out the podcast description for links to it and to Mapping Urbanities and Becoming Places, both by Routledge, and the paper we discussed, Towards a Morphogenesis of Informal Settlements. There's links too to Kim's professional and social profiles. And do share this episode, of course, and thanks for listening. Cheers.